Ryan Ellis didn't look up as he fired me. "You're done here." I was Trinity Lawson, Director of Risk Architecture at Crescent Solutions. I built the systems that processed $2.3 billion quarterly blocked federal investigations and kept us compliant. He thought I was overhead. I stood, silent, walked to the door, turned, "Call Leonard." November Continuity Audit. Page 47, subsection D. I left. No note. No farewell. Just my badge on the desk. I didn't take the USB. But I photographed its label, Continuity Protocols, Authorized Personnel Only, and sent it to my personal email with the timestamp, November 12, 2025. If you're new here and enjoying these powerful stories, make sure to hit that subscribe button and stay tuned for more. Let me know in the comments what part of today's story touched you most. I knew what would happen. The system didn't need me to be there. It needed me to be gone. Because I'd built it to lock down if my authorization was revoked. At 4:47 p.m., 31 minutes after I walked out, the alerts began. Transaction queue, stalled. Fraud checks, suspended. $1.4B in elevated risk transactions frozen. Julie texted, "Trinity, the dashboard is red. No one knows what to do." Leonard called. Panicked. "We need your override. I don't have clearance anymore. You're the only one who can fix this." "I can't. Legally I can't." I hung up. Set a timer. Waited. 90 minutes. The system wasn't punishing him. IT was protecting us. I hung up and waited. Ryan called minutes later, his voicemail full of hollow talk about a misunderstanding and needing my cooperation. I deleted it. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed, following the rules I'd put in place. Rules Ryan ignored. By 5:45 p.m. Julie's text came. Panic setting in, clients threatening to leave. I told her to have Leonard check page 47, subsection D. When he didn't understand, I said, "Call Evelyn. She will." At 6 p.m. my timer went off, 90 minutes. I drove home, ignoring the storm of calls and messages. This wasn't revenge. It was accountability. And for the first time the system was holding its ground. I didn't sleep much, my mind running through every scenario. Then at 11:47 p.m., an email from Evelyn Cross. "Emergency board session tomorrow at 8 a.m. Your presence is requested." I replied, confirmed. I'll be there, and finally found peace. Tomorrow wasn't about me. It was about consequences. The next morning I arrived early, dressed for battle. Evelyn met me with quiet respect. Ryan was waiting outside, already dismissed from the room. The boardroom was tense. Evelyn cut straight to the point. Ryan had terminated me without protocol, triggering a system-wide lockdown. Leonard confirmed. $1.8 billion in transactions frozen, no override possible without me. When they asked what happened, I laid it out plainly. Fired on the spot, no transition, no warning. And before I left, I'd told Ryan how to prevent this. Page 47, subsection D. He hadn't listened. Greg asked what was on page 47. I slid a copy of the continuity audit across the table. Subsection D was clear. Any departure of the risk director required a 30-day transition, or the system would trigger an operational lockdown. The room fell silent. Evelyn turned to me. "Ryan didn't read this." "No," I said. "He didn't." Evelyn looked at me. "Trinity, what would it take to fix this?" "3 things," I said. 1. Full reinstatement with back pay. 2. A contract clause requiring board approval and a 90-day transition if my role is ever eliminated. 3. Ryan completes a full review of the continuity protocols with Leonard and me, and signs off on understanding them. "Done," Evelyn said. "Paperwork by noon." She glanced at the others. "Ryan will be formally reprimanded and placed on probation. If he can't demonstrate competence in 30 days, we'll reconsider his position." All nodded in agreement. "Can you fix this?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Restore my access and keep Ryan out of my way for the next 48 hours. Consider it done." By 9:30 a.m. I was back at my desk. Monitors lit up, systems came online. No greetings, no acknowledgements, just work. I ran diagnostics, cleared false positives, flagged a suspicious Malta transfer and escalated it. By 11 a.m., 200 transactions processed. By 3 p.m. the queue was clear, systems green, clients calm. Julie stopped by, eyes red. I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do. You did fine, I said. It wasn't your fault. Are you back, for good? For now, I replied. We'll see. She nodded and left. I kept working. At 4:47 p.m., exactly 24 hours after the first alert, Ryan's email arrived. I apologize for the disruption. I'd like to schedule a time to review the operational protocols with you and Leonard. I stared at the screen, then replied, Thursday at 10 a.m. Bring your notes. I hit send, leaned back and smiled. Not because I'd won, but because the system had held. Thursday came faster than I expected. The office had settled back into its usual rhythm, the kind of hum that happens when people are busy enough to forget the drama. But I hadn't forgotten. Neither had Ryan. At 9:55 a.m., I walked into the conference room Leonard had reserved for our meeting. Ryan was already there, sitting at the far end of the table, laptop open, staring at the screen like it held the answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. Leonard sat across from him, legal pad out, pen ready, looking like a referee preparing for a cage match. I took a seat at the head of the table, equidistant from both of them, and set down my tablet. No pleasantries. No small talk. Just business. Let's start with the basics, I said, opening the continuity audit document. Ryan, have you read this? He glanced up, jaw tight. I skimmed it. Skim it again, I said, sliding a printed copy across the table. Out loud. Start with the executive summary. His eyes flicked to Leonard, looking for backup. Leonard just nodded. She's right. You need to understand this. Ryan exhaled through his nose, picked up the document and began reading. His voice was stiff, mechanical, like a student forced to read in front of the class. The continuity audit establishes operational safeguards to ensure uninterrupted service delivery in the event of personnel transitions, system failures, or regulatory escalations. Key positions, including the Director of Risk Architecture, are classified as mission-critical and require adherence to specific transition protocols. He stopped, looked up. I get it. I should have transitioned you properly. No, I said. You should have read the document before making a decision that put the company at risk. Keep reading. His jaw flexed, but he continued. Mission-critical roles must observe a minimum 30-day transition period, during which the outgoing officer trains designated successors, transfers authorization credentials, and completes all pending compliance reviews. Failure to observe this protocol results in automatic system lockdown. Stop, I said. That last part. Read it again. Failure to observe this protocol results in automatic system lockdown, he repeated, slower this time. Why? I asked. He blinked. Why what? Why does the system lock down? He stared at me, genuinely confused. Because it's in the protocol? No, I said. The system locks down because moving billions of dollars in client funds without proper oversight is a federal crime. The lockdown isn't punitive. It's protective. It's designed to prevent us from accidentally committing fraud. Do you understand that? Silence. He looked at Leonard. Leonard nodded. Yes, Ryan said finally. I understand. Good, I replied. Now let's talk about what happens next time. I spent the next hour walking him through the risk architecture piece by piece. Not because I enjoyed watching him squirm, but because if he was going to stay CEO, he needed to understand what he was managing. I explained the fraud detection parameters, the compliance overlays, the authorization hierarchies, the escalation trees. I showed him the federal guidelines we operated under, the audit schedules we adhered to, the client contracts that hinged on our ability to process transactions securely. By the end of it, he looked exhausted. Humbled maybe. Or just aware for the first time of how much he didn't know. Questions? I asked. Just one, he said. Why did you come back? I considered the question. It was a good one. I could have walked. Found another job. Left Ryan and Crescent Solutions to drown in their own incompetence. But that's not why I built what I built. Because the system matters, I said. And systems don't work if the people running them don't understand them. He nodded slowly. I owe you an apology. A real one. You do, I agreed. But I don't need it. I just need you to do better. He met my eyes for the first time since I'd walked into his office 2 days ago. I will. I believed him. Or at least I believed he believed it. Time would tell. 6 weeks later I was sitting in my office, door closed, reviewing the quarterly risk report when someone knocked. I looked up to see Ryan standing in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee. "Got a minute?" he asked. I gestured to the chair across from my desk. He sat down, handed me one of the coffees and took a sip from his own. We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that's comfortable rather than awkward. "I wanted to thank you," he said finally, "for not letting me destroy this company." "You're welcome," I replied. "But I didn't do it for you." "I know," he said. "But still. Thank you." I nodded, took a sip of coffee. It was good. Better than the burnt gas station swill I'd been drinking lately. "I've been thinking," he continued, "about succession planning. About what happens if something happens to you. Or to me. Or to anyone in a critical role. I want to build redundancy into the system. So this never happens again." I smiled. "That's a good idea. I'll need your help." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm still here." He stood, offered his hand. I shook it. Not as a peace offering but as a recognition. That we were both professionals trying to do right by the system we'd been entrusted to protect. After he left, I turned back to my report. The numbers were clean. The protocols were sound. The system was working. And that, in the end, was all that mattered. 3 months after the incident, Crescent Solutions held its annual company meeting. The kind of event where executives give speeches, employees pretend to care, and everyone eats mediocre catered food while avoiding eye contact. I usually skip these things. But this year, Evelyn had asked me to say a few words. Not about what happened. Just about the work. About the systems. About why it mattered. So I stood at the podium looking out at 200 faces, some familiar, some not, and I spoke. "Most of you don't know what I do," I began. "And that's fine. If I'm doing my job right, you shouldn't have to. Risk architecture isn't glamorous. It's not the kind of thing that makes headlines or wins awards. But it's the foundation everything else is built on. And foundations only get noticed when they fail." I paused, let that sink in. A few months ago we had a failure. Not of the system but of understanding. Someone made a decision without knowing the consequences. And we paid the price. But we learned from it. And that's what I want you to remember. Systems are only as strong as the people who maintain them. And maintenance isn't exciting. It's not flashy. But it's necessary. I looked directly at Ryan sitting in the front row. So the next time someone tells you a role is non-essential, ask yourself, do they understand what that role does? Do they know what happens if it disappears? Because if they don't, then they're not making an informed decision. They're guessing. And you can't build a company on guesses. Applause. Polite at first, then genuine. I stepped away from the podium and returned to my seat. Ryan caught my eye as I passed and gave a small nod. Not of defeat. Of respect. And that, I realized, was worth more than any apology. A year later I was still at Crescent Solutions. Still in my corner office. Still managing the systems that kept billions of dollars moving safely through the digital infrastructure. But things had changed. Ryan had changed. He'd taken the time to learn, to ask questions, to read the reports he used to skim. He'd built redundancy into the leadership structure, created succession plans, mandated training for every executive on operational dependencies. Me. I'd been promoted to Chief Risk Officer. Not because I asked for it but because Evelyn insisted. "You earned it," she'd said. "And more importantly, we need you in that role." So I took it. And I did what I always did. I built systems. I wrote protocols. I made sure that if I ever got hit by a bus, the company wouldn't collapse. Because that's what infrastructure means. It's not about being indispensable. It's about making sure the work continues no matter what. One afternoon I was sitting in a board meeting listening to Ryan present the quarterly earnings, when Evelyn leaned over and whispered, "You know, we almost lost everything because of him." "I know," I whispered back. "But we didn't. Because of you." I shrugged. "Because of the system." She smiled. "Same thing. Maybe it was. Maybe I'd become so intertwined with the work that there was no separating the two. But I was okay with that. Because the work mattered. The systems mattered. And someone had to care enough to protect them. Even if that someone had to walk out the door first to prove it. 2 years after the incident, I received an email from Julie. She'd been promoted to senior risk analyst and was leading a project to overhaul our fraud detection algorithms. She wanted my input. I called her into my office and we spent an hour going over her proposal. It was good. Really good. Better than anything I would have come up with at her level. This is excellent work, I told her. You should present it to the board. Her eyes widened. Really? Really, I said. You're ready. She smiled, gathered her notes and headed for the door. Then she stopped and turned back. Trinity, can I ask you something? Sure. When Ryan fired you, did you know what was going to happen? I thought about it. About the moment he said those words. About the walk to my desk. About the 90 minutes I spent waiting in my car. Yes, I said. I knew. How? Because I built the system, I replied. And I built it to protect itself. She nodded slowly, processing that. That's kind of brilliant. No, I said. It's just good architecture. She left and I turned back to my work. Because there was always more work to do. More protocols to write. More systems to protect. More people to train who would carry this forward when I was gone. That's the thing about infrastructure. It's not about one person. It's about the structure itself. And if you build it right, it lasts longer than any of us. 5 years after the incident, I was sitting in that same coffee shop, same table, same burnt Americano when my phone buzzed. An email from Ryan. The subject line read, "Thank you." I opened it. Trinity, I'm stepping down as CEO next month. It's time. But before I go, I wanted to thank you for teaching me what leadership actually means. Not the speeches or the strategy decks, but the unglamorous work of understanding what you're responsible for. You saved this company. More than that, you taught me how to see it clearly. I hope whoever comes next has the sense to listen to you the way I finally learned to. Ryan. I stared at the email for a long time. Read it twice. Then I replied with 2 words, good luck. Because that's all there was to say. He'd learned. The company had survived. The systems had held. Everything else was just noise. I finished my coffee, paid the bill and drove back to the office. There was a new hire starting next week. A junior analyst fresh out of graduate school with impressive credentials and 0 real-world experience. I'd be training her. Teaching her the same lessons I'd learned the hard way. How to build systems that protect themselves. How to write protocols that survive executive turnover. How to make yourself redundant so the work can continue without you. Because that's the real measure of success in infrastructure. Not how indispensable you are, but how well everything functions when you're not there. 7 years after the incident, Crescent Solutions went public. The IPO was massive, one of the biggest fintech offerings of the decade. Stock price tripled in the first week. Analysts called it a triumph of operational excellence and risk management. I watched the opening bell from my office. Door closed, monitors showing the stock ticker climbing higher and higher. Evelyn had offered me equity as part of my compensation package years ago. I'd accepted not because I cared about getting rich but because it was the right business decision. Now that equity was worth enough to retire. To walk away. To finally stop carrying the weight of other people's mistakes on my shoulders. But I didn't. Because the new CEO, a woman named Helena Grant who'd come from the Federal Reserve with 30 years of regulatory experience, had asked me to stay on as Chief Risk Officer. Not as a figurehead but as the person who still understood the systems better than anyone else. We need institutional memory, she'd said during our first meeting. People who remember when things almost fell apart. Who know how to prevent it from happening again. So I stayed. And I trained the next generation. And I wrote more protocols. And I sat through more board meetings. And I watched the company grow, expand, evolve into something bigger than I'd ever imagined when I first started. But the foundation, the core architecture, the systems that kept everything running, those stayed the same. Because I'd built them to last. And they had. 10 years after the incident, I was invited to speak at a conference on risk management. The kind of event where industry leaders gather to share best practices and pretend they have everything figured out. I almost declined. Public speaking wasn't my thing. But the organizers were persistent and eventually I agreed. The ballroom was packed. Hundreds of people, maybe more. Risk officers, compliance directors, CTOs, CFOs. All there to learn how to protect their companies from the kinds of failures that make headlines. I stood at the podium, looked out at the sea of faces and began. 10 years ago I was fired from my job. No warning, no explanation, just a CEO who thought my role was non-essential. 90 minutes later, the entire company's transaction processing system locked down. Billions of dollars frozen. Clients threatening to leave. Federal regulators asking questions. And the CEO who fired me was sitting in an emergency board meeting, trying to figure out how to fix what he'd broken. The room went silent. You could hear the air conditioning hum. I'm not telling you this to brag, I continued. I'm telling you this because it shouldn't have happened. The system I built was designed to protect the company even from itself. But it only worked because someone, in this case me, had taken the time to understand the dependencies, document the protocols, and build in safeguards that couldn't be overridden by ego or ignorance. I paused, let that sink in. How many of you know what would happen if your risk director left tomorrow? Not retired after a 6-month transition. Just left. Gone. Today. A few hands went up. Not many. Maybe 10% of the room. That's the problem, I said. Most companies don't know. They think risk management is insurance. Something you pay for and forget about until you need it. But it's not insurance. It's infrastructure. And infrastructure requires constant maintenance, clear documentation, and people who understand that boring, unglamorous work is what keeps everything from collapsing. I spoke for 40 minutes. Told them about the continuity audits, the authorization hierarchies, the compliance overlays. Explained how to build systems that survive personnel changes, executive turnover, and market disruptions. Showed them the templates, the checklists, the protocols that had saved Crescent Solutions and could save their companies too. When I finished, the applause was immediate and sustained. Not polite conference clapping, but genuine recognition. People stood. Some took photos. Others lined up afterward to ask questions, exchange contact information, request copies of my documentation. I answered every question. Shared every template. Because the whole point of building good systems is making sure they spread. That other people learn from your mistakes. That the next generation doesn't have to rediscover these lessons the hard way. 12 years after the incident, I was sitting in my office, reviewing a compliance report, when Julie knocked on my door. She was a director now, running her own team, overseeing fraud detection for the entire North American division. Got a minute? She asked. Always, I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. She sat down, fidgeting with her tablet. Nervous energy. The kind that comes before asking for something big. I've been offered a job, she said finally. Chief Risk Officer at a competitor. Smaller company, but they're growing fast. They want me to build their risk infrastructure from scratch. I smiled. That's excellent news. You should take it. She blinked. You think so? Absolutely, I said. You're ready. You've been ready for a year. I've just been selfish about keeping you here. I don't want to leave you hanging, she said. I know how hard transitions are. We'll manage, I replied. You'll give us 90 days notice, train your replacement, document everything. That's the protocol. And when you get to your new company, you'll build the same safeguards. Make yourself redundant. Teach others. Create systems that survive you. She nodded slowly. Like you did. Like I did, I confirmed. Because that's the job. Not being indispensable. Making sure the work continues no matter what. She stood, offered her hand. I shook it. Thank you, Trinity. For everything. You earned it, I said. Now go build something great. After she left, I turned back to my report. But I wasn't really reading it. I was thinking about the last 12 years. About Ryan's arrogance and Evelyn's support and Leonard's panic and Julie's growth. About systems that held and protocols that worked and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you built something that mattered. And I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. Not at Ryan, not at the board, not at anyone. Because the incident, painful as it was, had forced everyone to see what I'd been saying all along. That infrastructure matters. That boring work matters. That the people who keep the lights on deserve respect, protection, and proper transition protocols. The company had learned. The industry had learned. And maybe, just maybe, the next generation would remember. 15 years after the incident, I retired. Not because I had to, but because it was time. I'd trained my successor, a brilliant woman named Angela who understood risk architecture the way poets understand rhythm. I documented everything. Built redundancy into every system. Made sure that when I walked out the door for the last time, the company wouldn't even notice. My last day was quiet. No big party, no farewell speech. Just a small gathering in the conference room. Cake from the grocery store. Coffee in paper cups. A few people said nice things. Helena gave me a plaque that I'd probably never hang up. Julie flew in from her new job to give me a hug and tell me she'd named a compliance protocol after me. And Ryan sent a video message. He was gray now, retired himself, living somewhere warm and far from corporate America. But his words were clear. Trinity, I was the worst thing that ever happened to you at Crescent Solutions. But you were the best thing that ever happened to me. You taught me humility. You taught me respect. You taught me that leadership isn't about making bold decisions. It's about understanding the consequences of those decisions. Thank you for not giving up on me even when I deserved it. I watched it twice. Then I closed my laptop, said my goodbyes, and walked out of the building for the last time. My badge stayed on my desk. My monitors were dark. My office would be someone else's by Monday. But the systems I'd built, the protocols I'd written, the safeguards I'd installed, those would remain. Long after I was forgotten, they'd keep working. Protecting billions of dollars. Preventing disasters. Holding the line between order and chaos. And that, I realized as I drove away from Crescent Solutions for the last time, was the best legacy anyone could hope for. 5 years into retirement, I was sitting on my back porch, reading a book I'd been meaning to finish for a decade when my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer. But something made me pick up. Hello. Trinity Lawson? A young voice. Male. Nervous. Speaking. Hi, my name is Colin. I'm a risk analyst at Crescent Solutions. Well, new risk analyst. Started last month. And I was going through the documentation library and I found all your protocols. The continuity audits, the authorization hierarchies, everything. And I just wanted to call and say thank you. Because they're incredible. Like genuinely brilliant. And everyone here still talks about you. About how you built the systems that saved the company. I smiled. Felt something warm in my chest. Not pride exactly. More like satisfaction. The kind that comes from knowing your work outlasted you. That's kind of you to say, Colin. I mean it, he continued. I'm studying your frameworks in my graduate program. My professor calls them the gold standard for risk architecture. Said if I want to build a career in this field, I should memorize everything you wrote. Well, I said, tell your professor I appreciate that. And tell yourself something too. What's that? Don't just memorize the protocols. Understand why they exist. Understand the consequences of not following them. Because that's what separates good risk management from great risk management. Not the rules themselves, but the wisdom to know when and how to apply them. I will, he said. Thank you, Ms. Lawson. Just Trinity, I replied. And good luck, Colin. You're going to do great. I hung up and set the phone down. Picked up my book. But I didn't read. Just sat there watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Somewhere in the city, Colin was probably sitting at his desk, reading my documentation, learning the lessons I'd written down so he wouldn't have to make the same mistakes I did. And somewhere else, Julie was teaching her team the same principles. And Angela was training her successor. And the systems were running quietly, efficiently, keeping billions of dollars safe. That's the thing about infrastructure. You never see it. But it's always there. Holding everything together. Making sure the lights stay on. Making sure the world keeps turning. And if you build it right, it lasts forever. 20 years after the incident, I was invited back to Crescent Solutions for their anniversary celebration. The company had grown exponentially. Offices in 12 countries. 50,000 employees. Processing trillions of dollars annually. But the core systems, the risk architecture, the compliance frameworks, those were still rooted in the work I'd done decades ago. I walked through the lobby, past the modern art installations and the coffee bar that served drinks I couldn't pronounce, and felt like a time traveler visiting the future. Nothing looked the same, but everything felt familiar. Helena met me in the atrium, older now but still sharp, still commanding. Trinity, thank you for coming. Wouldn't miss it, I said. She led me upstairs to a conference room where a small group had gathered. Board members, executives, senior leadership. People I'd worked with and people I'd never met. And in the corner, a framed photograph on an easel. It was me. Younger, serious, standing in front of a whiteboard covered in flowcharts and diagrams. I didn't remember when it was taken. Probably during one of those marathon planning sessions where we mapped out the original continuity protocols. Beneath the photo, a plaque. Trinity Lawson, Architect of Resilience 2008 to 2025. We wanted to honor you, Helena said. Not just for what you built but for what you represented. The idea that infrastructure matters. That the quiet work matters. That the people who protect us from disasters we'll never see deserve recognition. I stared at the photo, at the plaque, at the faces around me. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not pride. Not vindication. Just peace. Thank you, I said quietly. The rest of the event was a blur. Speeches, presentations, a video montage of the company's history that featured a 30-second clip of me explaining risk protocols to a camera I didn't remember facing. People came up to shake my hand, tell me how my work had influenced theirs, ask for advice on problems I hadn't thought about in years. And through it all I kept thinking about that moment. 20 years ago. Sitting in Ryan's office. Hearing those words. You're done here. If I'd known then what I know now, would I have done anything differently? Would I have argued? Fought back? Demanded an explanation? No. Because the system worked. The safeguards held. And in the end the work spoke louder than any defense I could have offered. 25 years after the incident, I received a letter in the mail. Handwritten envelope. No return address. I opened it carefully, unfolded the single sheet of paper inside and read. Dear Trinity, you don't know me but I know you. I'm a risk officer at a financial services company you've probably never heard of. 5 years ago my CEO tried to eliminate my position. He said I was overhead. Non-essential. That we could automate everything I did. But I'd read your story. Studied your protocols. Built the same safeguards into our systems. And when he tried to cut me, the system locked down. Just like yours did. He called me 90 minutes later, apologizing, offering to reinstate me with better terms. I said yes. Not because I wanted revenge but because the work mattered. And I just wanted to thank you. For showing me that it's possible to build systems that protect themselves. That respect the people who maintain them. That survive even when the people in charge don't understand them. You changed my life. And you probably changed 1,000 other lives you'll never hear about. So thank you. From all of us who learned from you. Anonymous. I read the letter 3 times. Then I folded it carefully, placed it back in the envelope and set it on my desk next to the plaque from Crescent Solutions. And I smiled. Because that's what it was all about. Not the recognition. Not the awards. Not the plaques or the speeches or the anniversary celebrations. It was about the work. Systems. The protocols. The quiet knowledge that somewhere out there people were building better infrastructure because I'd shown them how. That's the legacy. Not me. The work. And the work, as it turned out, was just beginning. 30 years after the incident, I was sitting in a university lecture hall, listening to a professor teach a class on risk management. The room was packed with students, young and eager, notebooks open, pens ready. The professor, a man about my age with gray hair and kind eyes, was walking them through a case study. And as he spoke I realized what case study it was. In 2025, he began, a CEO named Ryan Ellis made a decision that nearly destroyed his company. He fired the director of risk architecture without understanding what that role actually did. Within 90 minutes the company's transaction processing system had locked down, billions of dollars were frozen, and the board was convening an emergency session to figure out how to fix it. The students leaned forward, engaged. But here's the fascinating part, the professor continued. The director, Trinity Lawson, had anticipated this exact scenario. Not because she was paranoid but because she understood systems. She'd built safeguards into the architecture that protected the company even from its own leadership. Automatic lockdowns. Authorization hierarchies. Compliance triggers. All designed to prevent catastrophic failure. He pulled up a slide showing one of my original flowcharts. I recognized it immediately. The one I'd drawn on that whiteboard all those years ago. This, he said, tapping the screen, is what we call defensive architecture. Building systems that protect themselves. That recognize when something's wrong and respond accordingly. It's not about ego. It's not about power. It's about ensuring continuity even when humans make mistakes. A student raised her hand. But didn't she come back? Didn't the company rehire her? They did, the professor confirmed. And she agreed, but only on her terms. Full reinstatement. Contractual protections. Mandatory transition protocols. She didn't just save herself. He changed the way the company operated. Made sure this could never happen again. Another student spoke up. Is she still alive? The professor smiled. She is. Actually, she's sitting in the back of this room right now. Every head turned. I raised my hand slightly, acknowledging the attention. The room erupted in applause. Not the polite kind. The genuine kind. The kind that says, we see you, we understand what you did, and we want to learn from you. After class, students lined up to talk to me. Ask questions. Hear stories. Learn lessons. I stayed for 2 hours, answering every question, sharing every insight, making sure they understood that the work they were about to do mattered more than they could possibly know. Because that's how it continues. That's how the knowledge spreads. One student at a time. One risk officer at a time. One company at a time. Until defensive architecture isn't the exception. It's the standard. I'm Trinity Lawson. And 30 years ago a CEO told me I was done. He was wrong. The work was never done. The systems needed constant maintenance. The protocols required regular updates. The next generation needed training. But I'd built something that lasted. Something that protected people who couldn't protect themselves. Something that held the line when everything else fell apart. And that's all any of us can hope for. To build something that matters. To teach others how to maintain it. And to trust that long after we're gone the work will continue. Because infrastructure isn't about one person. It's about the structure itself. And if you build it right, it lasts forever.